Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to the mysterious and ever-incisive Daily Sceptic columnist Sorel on Keir Starmer's technocratic plan to end parliamentary democracy, David McGrogan on a recent Supreme Court ruling that puts the future of UK oil and gas in question, and the tyrannical tendency of BBC disinformation reporter Marianna Spring.
Why do you hate me? Well, I hope you don't. But it turns out quite a few people do.
And Alex Kriel, the founder of thinkingcoalition.org, on the elephant in the room in the general election campaign.
It's unbelievable for me that you can look at a chart and discuss anything other than lockdowns.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic a month, our bonus interview this week is with Eugippius, who gives us a deep dive into German politics and the right-wing waves sweeping Europe. If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. So, if the polls are to be believed, Keir Starmer is on the cusp of winning a massive majority at the general election on Thursday. Now, the last time a Labour government turfed out the Tories, it proved to be massively transformative. Tony Blair's new Labour brought in the Human Rights Act, a Supreme Court, and the Equality Act, to name just 3 of the major constitutional changes that government brought in. And while Keir Starmer may try to present himself as an unassuming centrist dad, his plans are equally radical. So I'm pleased to be joined now by someone who's looked closely at those plans, and that's the pseudonymous Daily Sceptic columnist Sorel. Welcome, Mr. Sorel.
Hi, nice to be here.
So you've written for us this week about Starmer and Starmer's plans for the Constitution, which you describe as being the wholesale transfer of power from Parliament to civil servants, judges, and quangocrats. Now, before we get on to Starmerism as a political doctrine, obviously a huge amount of political commentary on Keir Starmer has been about trying to diagnose him and his character. And one of the main lines of criticism that's been settled on has been that he's a flip-flopper, that he doesn't believe in anything. But you say that's wrong. So how should we understand Keir Starmer the man?
So Starmer's path to power is an unconventional one. In terms of his background, his career before he entered politics, I think he might be what you might describe as, a sort of a necessary figure for any regime. So sort of an enforcer who does quite a bit of sort of the daily grind of enforcement. And as DPP, that was very much his job. So he was, on the ground with the frivolous arrests over jokes, the famous jokes trial in 2003 and 2004, possibly, the ASBOs, the high-vis policemen. He's sort of a man who had to sort of take on quite a lot of the heat of sort of the grim day-to-day enforcement. So he's not really a man who you would really expect to go into frontline politics. You'd think that he'd be bound for, a life peerage and then, sort of relative obscurity in the House of Lords. So it was quite striking that he entered Parliament quite abruptly at quite an advanced age and was given an ultra-safe seat. There's a sort of a tendency, I suppose, amongst sort of political orders that, in unsettled times, there's something of an impulse to say, okay, let's find these quite distinguished figures who seem to be kind of in some way non-partisan, or at least not sort of stridently partisan, who can sort of, bring some ballast, some heft, some sort of some independent judgment to the political nation. I think Starmer was very much seen in that vein. So let's bring in this former prosecutor. I think there's a quite striking parallel with Sue Gray, who's his sort of great, obviously his chief of staff, his great contemporary. She was cast as also something of an enforcer. So she had to do sort of the dirty work, the grind, the less glamorous tasks. And she somewhat resented, or at least she's very much putting out that she resented, the sort of glitter and glamour of people like Simon Case, Jeremy Haywood, 2 of the sort of senior mandarins. So his career has been one of enforcement. And I think his abiding political belief is that he's a generation younger than the original protagonists of New Labour. So he was a young man when that system came into being in 1997, sort of the settlement of 1997. And I think he thinks it's his job basically to enforce and to preserve that society. He has certain views on what is judicious, what is decent in public life. As a politician, he's primarily concerned with constitutional issues of sort of standards and ethics in public life. He's quite sort of a moralist, possibly, in ways that other politicians aren't as much. So I think that's basically his mission in life. He thinks that, after Brexit, after the sort of the populist scare from the left and the right, there needs to be a sort of a restoration of order at a high level in terms of the constitution and in terms of standards in public life. I think that's basically what he's out to do. He doesn't really seem to have many opinions about foreign affairs, economic affairs. He's happy to franchise those out to his team.
So Keir Starmer's not really a politician, as you mentioned, and he doesn't really have strong political views. And then there's also this sense of him being almost outraged by what to anyone else would be really just the cut and thrust of politics.
Defining a woman! Although in fairness, that was only 99% of a U-turn.
For instance, there was this joke about Starmer's inconsistency on trans that Rishi Sunak made while Brianna Ghey's mother was in the Commons gallery. And to anyone else, this would just be sort of politicians trying to rib each other about their weak spots, right? But Starmer took this as this kind of unbelievably grievous, dishonourable thing to do by Sunak.
All the work of all the weeks to say that when Brianna's mother is in this chamber. Shame.
And you've argued that this speaks to his character a lot, because he's not actually being cynical about that. This is really the way he thinks. And similarly, we saw when an audience laughed at his, repeating for the 1,000th time this line about his father having been a toolmaker.
But when I grew up, my dad was a toolmaker. He worked in a factory. It's true. My mum was a nurse, and actually we couldn't make ends meet, which actually isn't a laughing matter. We couldn't make ends meet.
He got so outraged by this because he just couldn't even consider the idea that people would prick his immense bubble of seriousness. So is that is that one way to understand him as a politician?
Yes, there's no feel for like the cut and thrust, as you say. It's quite sort of a vulgar anti-politics. It's sort of weirdly sort of Bonapartist. The frivolous politicians have messed things up. So now it's time for some kind of central restoration of order. But quite a classic appeal. And I think that manifests itself in quite a few ways, this basic anti-politics. One of them is the attempt to subordinate Parliament to sort of codes of values inside Parliament, things like the Nolan principles. This sort of genuinely quite sort of risible. I encourage everyone listening to go look these up. They really have to be seen to be believed. This list of guiding principles in public life. And also he wants to hive off the powers of Parliament, obviously. I mean, this is not peculiar to Keir Starmer, but there's always been the basic constitutional programme of New Labour has always been to try and diminish Parliament. There's a great parade is made about, Parliament's question time. It's this sort of, this jungle, this sort of chaos. But really, I think it's quite revealing. It's sort of a hatred for debate, especially after Brexit. I think these people Britain's governing class writ large, are quite sort of genuinely shocked and angry at the idea of political opposition. They don't really think it has a right to exist. That's very, very native to Starmer.
Yes, definitely. I mean, there were those very revealing comments that he made last year when he was asked whether he prefers Davos or Westminster. And he said Davos. And that was because Westminster is apparently too sort of combative, too shouty, too tribal, I think he said. And well, I mean, it would be. It's the place where the debate happens, right? But so there's this kind of personal, almost disdain for politics as politics. But moving on from Starmer the man for a second, let's go on to his constitutional programme. How does that inform how he thinks about politics?
Yeah. So in many ways, it will be a continuation of something that's been a quarter of a century in the making. So the basic idea of New Labour is decentralisation in many ways. Britain has the most sort of concentrated unitary constitution in the world. There's no law that binds Parliament, obviously, even now. But the constitutional programme New Labour was to break that apart. So to give power, to create a Supreme Court, to greatly empower the Quangos, and to decentralise Britain sort of territorially. So creating, obviously, the devolved assemblies. And then there was an attempt at English devolution as well, though thwarted. And Starmer wants to continue this in many ways. It's going to be a very, very sort of broad constitutional package. He commissioned Gordon Brown to do the first draft of this. It was called A New Britain. And it was very, very wide-ranging. It includes quite a few sort of howlers that have since been watered down or sort of ignored. So one of them is basically giving the devolved assemblies the right to conclude their own international agreements. That's now been watered down considerably in the manifesto. There was obviously the replacing of the House of Lords with the Senate of Nations and Regions, which has been delayed as well. But a lot of stuff is going to happen. So I think key among them is the even further franchising out of government to quangos, to arm's length bodies. This is something that the Conservatives have certainly connived in themselves. They created, as part of their NHS reform, something called NHS England. And quite touchingly, they thought that if we give it out to this body, then we won't be held responsible for what happens in English health in the future. What it really meant is that, of course, they took all the blame or for whatever happened, but they had very little control over the internal processes of the NHS. I've actually heard from some people in sort of the broader Westminster world that people working on health policy in various think tanks or bodies, they actually on their list of sort of key contacts, the head of NHS England is placed above the Secretary of State for Health, and Labour will certainly accelerate this. So chiefly, they want to submit all budgets to the OBR, or all fiscal events actually to the OBR. This is something that, again, that the Tories created, which will then render a forecast publicly available on what the effects of this will be. But that will basically congeal into something like a veto over fiscal policy. So the British people won't really be able to elect a government with sort of a new fiscal policy, because it will all sort of break apart at the OBR's quasi-veto. They also want to do things like give energy out to a body called Great British Energy, which would be another NHS England-style body. There was nothing in the manifesto actually really about expanding the scope of judicial review, but it can probably just be sort of taken as read that will happen. The judiciary sort of grows ever bolder in where they intervene on. Further, there's going to be a reform to the central processes of government in Whitehall and in the cabinet. There was something called, a few months ago, from the Institute for Government called the Power with Purpose report. And it basically wants to do away, finally, with the idea that the civil service is just the employees that the executive happens to employ to carry out. It's going to make the civil service at last like an actual constitutional actor. So it's going to create a department of the civil service with a minister for the civil service. And there's going to be basically, rather than so much ministers giving civil servants direct orders, they never really could in the first place. But they could with enough effort. But that sort of polite fiction is going to be kind of done away with. Instead, they're going to work out a series of governance priorities for government rather, with the civil service at the beginning of every new parliament, with a panel of civil servants, representatives from the Treasury, the departments, and the Ministry of the Civil Service. This panel will have scope to consider things like workability. So again, that creates another sort of quasi-veto, because they can say on quite sort of subjective grounds, that's unworkable or unlawful or not value for money, so it won't run. So a real decentralization of power, such that the executive is really just kind of one actor among many and has to sort of petition these various bodies to do anything.
Right. And so one of the points you make in your recent pieces is about the radicalism of these constitutional changes. And one of the things that's strange is that there's still this perception of Starmer as being this kind of boring, insipid technocrat. That he's just the return to normality, or as Rachel Reeves' slogan puts it, it's stability is change. But you're trying to point out that no, actually, they are being quite radical. And you say that the constitutional changes they'd bring in are so far-reaching that it would mean that upon coming to power, a right-wing reforming government would face an immediate constitutional crisis in which actual authority was contested and civil servants would be unsure who to obey. So you kind of suggest that even despite all these constitutional changes, the sovereign authority of Parliament would still be there under even an immense amount of sort of constitutional bubble wrap. But how are the prospects for a potential reforming government in the future trying to reverse Starmerism? Very,
very, very difficult indeed. I think an analogy can be found in the constitutional crisis, the long rattling crisis of summer 2019 to winter 2019, when Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson got in, and there was the crisis of a prorogation, the expelling of 21 One Nation MPs from the party, the showdown with the Supreme Court over prorogation, things like that. You're right. There's nothing in the manifesto about formally dispensing with the idea of parliamentary sovereignty. That means that, a route backwards remains. But it'll have to be something that's quite stridently asserted. There'll need to be basically any reforming government that comes to power will have to say, basically our only task is to get control of the British state on behalf of the people who just elected us. Policy obviously can be used for some popular appeal to help in that effort, but really the overriding task is to say, the British people have control of the machinery of the government through us. So they'll have to sort of assert this. You can already see the sort of early murmurs of this sort of an actual sort of crisis of authority where various people don't know who to obey, in that the Civil Service Code says that civil servants, can't disobey international law. So you already have baked into the system this idea of there are sort of potential, dual powers. Obviously, in a variety of ways that will increase and things will become even more diffuse. So, what happens if the Supreme Court says one thing and the Crown and Parliament says another, and the Supreme Court insists on some, right of veto, some expanded idea of judicial review? What happens if the Quangos, various arm's length bodies, say, we have a chartered right to scrutinize this legislation, or to lodge objections, or to delay things? All kinds of tools will be used to harry a sort of reforming government, and it will take sort of a lot of will to oppose them. And I think anyone who's not willing to say, really we're going to have to be willing to ignore the OBR or to shut it down or do all kinds of things, is sort of wasting their followers' time, because we've kind of tested to destruction the idea that you can just sort of work within these bodies. It's not that they're sort of instinctively hostile to any one political group, although I think they are, but it doesn't work. It's too diffuse. These bodies, for example, the Parliamentary Ethics and Standards one, are in many ways sort of overlapping and contradictory in their briefs and their jurisdictions. It's completely ramshackle and ungovernable. And I think Rishi Sunak was sort of destroyed by this system, and the next one will be.
Okay, so we've discussed how far-reaching these changes will be and how essentially they'll set any reforming government on a pretty much revolutionary footing as soon as they enter power. Why do you think so many people underestimate the radicalism of Starmerism?
I think there's a certain kind of lobby journalist who has this quite sort of wry belief that, things never really change and things are always sort of broadly intelligible. There's sort of a rigmarole, a cut and thrust. At the end of the day, people are sort of basically cynical and intelligible within a political system. It owes quite a bit to the sort of the tropes of Yes Minister, things like that. The tropes of The Thick of It, those programs have quite deep cultural imprint.
He's absolutely useless.
Also, I think that people don't really appreciate how radical New Labour was still, and so a continuation of that doesn't seem so jarring. But I mean, you can trace the vast majority of the issues that afflicted, I think, Rishi Sunak were constitutional in nature. So he was contending directly with the legacy of Blair and Brown, things like the Human Rights Act, and then the Nolan Principles, which were used to sort of pick off his ministerial bench over relative trifles.
Okay, so one of the key themes of your work is that you describe yourself as an apologist for Parliament and sort of for parliamentary democracy as such. Could you just expand on why you think it's so important to be an apologist for parliamentary democracy and why you think that's such an important system that we have?
Yeah, sure. So Britain is blessed with a system that means that sort of course correction is uniquely possible here. So, our membership of the EU was brought to an end with a parliamentary vote. It divided. That's it. It was a royal signature. But we have a very, very centralized system of government which admits no, overriding rules on what has to happen. There's no constitution, code of values. So we can decide all these things for ourselves. And I think it's the most modern system of government, because if we take the idea that, okay, the story of politics, the grand story of politics in the last, several centuries is things getting more centralized, and also these sort of overweening spirits and spooks, which constrain the actions of us on earth, are sort of falling away. Then a system that says everything is completely centralized in one institution in the capital city, and there's no limit to what it can do. It's not limited by any sort of wider code of of values. It is the most important task for anyone who wants to see any reform to the way Britain is to maintain parliamentary sovereignty. With it, everything is possible. Without it, very little is.
Okay, well, Jay Sorel, thanks very much for coming on.
Great, thank you.
Now, the future of fossil fuel energy projects in the UK is under threat after a startling new ruling from the Supreme Court. A 3-2 majority found in favour of anti-oil and gas campaigners in Surrey, who argued that a council should have taken account of climate impacts when approving new oil wells. To talk more about this, I'm joined by Dr. David McGrogan, Associate Professor of Law at Northumbria University. So tell us more about the Supreme Court decision and why it matters.
So I think probably how this case has been reported, and probably what you will have heard about it, is that it's to do with another ruling to do with net zero and climate change and so on and so forth. So the first thing to really say about this judgment of the Supreme Court, so this is the case of Finch and Surrey County Council, is that it's not exactly a case about climate change or net zero per se. It's really about a much deeper issue, which everybody, I think, should be concerned with, regardless of their views about climate. And I want to make clear, I consider myself to have reasonably mainstream views on climate change, in the sense that, I think it's probably reasonable to do something about carbon emissions and try to get them down. I just don't believe in the apocalyptic scenarios that tend to be trotted out for what's in store if we don't, So I consider myself to be kind of like a climate centrist, I suppose, a normal person, I suppose, with normal beliefs about climate. So this decision isn't really about that issue so much as it's about what I would describe as being a kind of enfeeblement of democratic decision-making and a replacement by a kind of technocratic, expert-oriented approach to government, which I think we can kind of see all around us, and which obviously impacts on, let's say, environmental policy as well. So it's really kind of more to do with that. So to cut a long story short, there's an EU directive which has been given effect in the UK by regulations which were enacted in 2017. Now, this EU directive then, as it was enacted in UK law, requires approval for any development project that's likely to have a significant effect on the environment to be given only after there has been something called an environmental impact assessment, or EIA, right? So a developer has to give an environmental impact assessment, usually to the local council, before they'll give approval for a development project, right? So the council has to require that at law, right, by these regulations. So here we had the developer of a proposed oil well at a place called Horse Hill in Surrey, and they duly submitted an environmental impact assessment to Surrey County Council, basically asking for them, to approve the project on that basis. That was challenged by the claimant here, somebody called Miss Finch, who you can think of as a kind of an avatar, really, for various environmental NGOs who funded her, and I'll come to that in due course. So her claim was that when the environmental impact assessment was submitted, the developer for the site only included an account of potential carbon emissions that were associated with the project itself. So the carbon that would be emitted, the greenhouse gases, I suppose to say, that would be emitted during the construction and the operation, and eventually the cleanup and restoration operation for the project. So her argument was, and I should say, as the representative of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and so on, and various other environmental NGOs, was that the impact assessment should have included an estimate for all of the greenhouse emissions that would be caused by the project, meaning, of course, the downstream consumption of the oil itself. So the developer shouldn't have said, these will be the emissions associated with the project. It should have said, these are the emissions that are associated with the project. And also, we need to include in the environmental impact an assessment of what will happen when the oil is eventually refined and combusted, right, and used in industry. So, this is a project specifically for the extraction of crude oil. So you have to include in your estimate of the environmental impact what will happen downstream, right, when the oil is eventually used. So it's not a challenge to the fact that the council approved the project per se. It's a challenge to how the process was carried out. right? Should the council have taken into account, or to rephrase that, should the council have forced the developer to take into account the carbon emissions that would occur throughout the use of the oil, that would have been extracted from the oil well? Or was the council acting lawfully in simply limiting the impact assessment or okaying the impact assessment on the basis just of the carbon emissions that would be generated during construction and operation of the project? So it's quite a technical issue, really, about the decision-making process, right? So it's not really about necessarily whether or not we're going to achieve net zero, or what councils should be requiring developers to do in terms of substance. It's more about the process, right? The Supreme Court decided in favour of the claimant, right, that if you're going to submit an environmental impact assessment as a developer, then you should be required by the local authority to include in your calculations all of the potential environmental impacts downstream of the project, so including all of the greenhouse gas emissions that might be generated as a result of what the project is designed to do, in this case, for example, to extract oil. So that obviously is going to put a bigger burden on developers. Yeah, because so to give you an example of the kind of burden it could put on a developer, just in the last year or two, the Irish Supreme Court heard a challenge to decision-making process behind a project for the creation of a plant for processing milk. And this was challenged on the basis that when the environmental impact assessment was submitted, the developer didn't include a calculation for the methane that would be emitted by the cows, the increased number of cows that would be needed to supply milk to the plant. Because cows obviously fart, and that produces methane, and that's a greenhouse gas emission. So the environmental impact assessment should have included in a calculation for the extra methane, if you like, that would have been emitted by the cows that would have been supplying the extra milk to this milk plant. Now, luckily for people in Ireland, the Irish Supreme Court held that was taking things a step too far. That wasn't, the developer wasn't required to include that in the impact assessments. But in the UK now, thanks to this Supreme Court decision, it seems likely that that kind of developers will be required to take account of that kind of almost reductio ad absurdum approach to what the environmental impact of a project could be. Right, they're going to have to take into account, well, what possible greenhouse gas emissions might result from this project, which on its face might not really have anything to do with fossil fuels, like the processing of milk, for example. So this is going to impose a big burden on developers, no doubt, right? Which is obviously the last thing the country needs, right? a yet more expensive and burdensome process for approving planning decisions. But I said that this issue, the decision here is concerning for another reason, right? The reason why it's concerning, really, setting aside the issue of making the planning process more expensive and burdensome, is that what this really represents is a narrowing of the scope for democratic decision making, and actually what I would call a corruption of the democratic process by sort of technocratic impulses.
Right. So that's obviously very concerning, and many of our audience will be wondering who politically is to blame here. So obviously we might point to the Supreme Court that it's been able to make this ruling, and obviously that's, as we actually spoke about in a previous interview, is a Blairite constitutional innovation. Or is it the Tories' net zero legislation, infamously brought in with very little scrutiny by Theresa May in her government in 2019, in the dying days of it, in fact? Or is it something else? What's to blame here, David?
Yeah, well, there's lots of blame to go around, right? But I think one element of the decision that I haven't seen being widely reported, but which I think is it comes through very, very clearly in Lord Legate's judgment, is that his decision, the decision of the majority in the Supreme Court, which found in favour of the appellant Ms. Finch, is that his decision, their decision, was very strongly influenced by an intervention by a quango, something called the Office for Environmental Protection. Now, this body was actually set up by the government itself as an independent, non-departmental organisation only in 2021, so very, very recently. And it appears to have been set up more or less with the express purpose of participating in strategic litigation, like the kind of litigation that I'm describing here, on the grounds that there should be some process by which public bodies can be, quote unquote, held to account from a kind of environmental protection perspective. So Lord Leggett says on 2 separate occasions in his judgment that this intervention by the Office for Environmental Protection, which made a submission at the Supreme Court stage, actually swayed his decision. And it's important there to be absolutely clear about what happened. At trial in the High Court, the judge found in favour of the council, and so did the Court of Appeal, a very, very eminent Court of Appeal, in the subsequent appeal from that decision at trial. So it's only at the Supreme Court level that we find the court being swayed in favour of the appellant here, Ms. Finch, and it seems to have been under the influence of this Office for Environmental Protection and its submission. So what you have is this a sort of intervention by a technocratic expert body, if you like, to kind of sway the judiciary to come to a particular decision, which has the effect of second guessing or undermining or kind of enfeebling the democratic decision-making process within the county council itself. So I'm currently writing an article which will appear, I think, on the Daily Sceptic and in my own Substack. I guess there might be a link put up in the notes to this episode on the kind of wider issues, but and on the subject really of blame. But to really simplify, so it's partly the EU, obviously, because this all stems from an EU directive, which was implemented into UK law and which wasn't altered in the aftermath of Brexit. Although I should make clear that the actual kind of facts of the dispute occurred in 2019, so EU law would have applied then at that time anyway, and courts have to apply the law that was that was applicable at that moment in time. So this EU directive on environmental impact assessments actually seems more or less designed in order to facilitate this kind of environmental lawfare. It describes itself as being designed to make decision-making more, quote-unquote, accountable to the public. But once you look at the small print in the directive, it becomes clear that the public actually really means environmental NGOs. That's what the public concerned is actually defined as meaning. And this litigation in the case of Finch and Surrey County Council was obviously funded by environmental NGOs, including Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. So it seems as though the EU directive is almost kind of geared to encourage strategic litigation by environmental NGOs. So the EU is no doubt, to a certain extent, to blame. But then obviously, we should never neglect blame of the Tory party. I'm sure that's something that all listeners can agree with. Why did they set up the Office for Environmental Protection? Well, it was set up only in 2021. So this is not something that can be blamed on Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, which is the standard kind of knee-jerk response of the Tory party whenever they encounter some kind of this kind of problem, right? They always blame kind of constitutional changes that were ushered in during the New Labour years. That's largely a myth, and this is a good indication as to why that's a myth. The Office for Environmental Protection was set up under a Tory government only in 2021. And again, it seems designed specifically to engage in strategic litigation with respect to environmental issues. So that is emblematic, I think, not really of any kind of climate change specific problem, but actually a broader approach to government that really represents a kind of shift away from democratic decision making and a desire to reduce the scope of democratic decision making as much as possible, to sort of, the word I used earlier on, or the phrase I used earlier on, was to kind of hem in executive decision making by democratically elected bodies towards a more kind of a technocratic regulatory approach, where you get these decisions of public policy being not exactly made by experts, but very, very heavily influenced by experts from a kind of procedural point of view. So here you have, a classic example of that in this case, where you've got the Office for Environmental Protection intervening in a Supreme Court decision to sway the Supreme Court towards holding that a county council erred in the way that it took into account an environmental impact assessment. So that's emblematic of a wider sort of a suspicion of democratic processes in general, I think, that's across the piece, not just in relation to climate change or net zero or environmental policy in general.
Right, so thanks for that update on that really important story. But I know there's another thing you've written about for us this week. So Reform are rising in the polls, and the BBC don't seem to be taking it very well. So tell us about this story you've written about the BBC's disinformation correspondent this week, Marianna Spring.
Yeah, Marianna Spring, yeah. Yeah, so this is a Substack post that I wrote, I guess towards the end of last week, and that was reposted on the Daily Sceptic. And I want to make clear, I don't have any particular animus against Marianna Spring. I'm sure in her mind, I'm sure that what she's doing is, deeply important and also, on the side of the angels. But I'm very skeptical about, obviously, as I'm sure you are as well, about the entire kind of disinformation, misinformation movement, if we can use that word, the censorship industrial complex as it's often described. So Spring has basically, I'm sure readers will have read the BBC story that she's put out because it was quite prominent on the website. But what she's done is basically she's trawled TikTok, and she's discovered that, shock horror, when you look at a TikTok video nowadays, the chances are that you might see a comment saying something like vote reform, right? Or reform UK, or some little, short slogan like, vote reform is net zero immigration or something like that. You'll get some kind of reform slogan. Now, in her mind, this can only be the result of bots, right? She's convinced that this must be, and the implication is that it's Russian bots. Obviously, it's kind of a foreign intervention in our election. Even though she can't really find any evidence of this, there's absolutely no evidence that that's the case that's adduced in the actual article. There's one account where she manages to find something that she thinks is a little bit fishy to do with the kind of the syntax of the of the comments. But basically that's that. There's just absolutely, it's all smoke and no fire. But she nonetheless manages to put this very sinister and kind of dangerous, nefarious aspect on the whole affair, right? And what attracted my attention and what made me laugh about it initially was just reflecting, this is really just complaining about something which people have always done and will inevitably do, which is signaling their support for a political party during a general election campaign, right? Walk around your local neighborhood, go for a drive around your local town centre, city centre. You will find that people put signs in their windows or in their gardens or on street corners saying things like, vote Lib Dem, vote Labour, that's what people do, and of course they're going to do that online as well. Of course they're going to leave those kinds of comments on TikTok videos and in tweets and Facebook posts and so on and so forth. This is just the online equivalent of something that people have always done in the physical space. So what on earth is suspicious or nefarious about it? It's just part of the normal process of a general election campaign. But what I felt really needed to be commented on was the wording of the interpretation that she gives. And I'm going to read this out. It's very short, but I think it's important to just, to clarify the wording that she uses or to refer to it. So comments that boost the perceived support for a political party, whether they come from UK voters or inauthentic accounts. So note she's got her suspicions about inauthentic accounts, can embolden more real people to join in. And then she says, it is one more piece of evidence in this election that suggests individual social media users and anonymous accounts have the ability to shape the online conversation just as effectively as the content coming from the political parties themselves. So you'll notice that this is very telling, right? We mustn't embolden people to join in with politics, right? That's the last thing we want. We don't want to embolden real people to join in the democratic process, right? And we certainly mustn't have them talking to one another about politics, right? And thereby undermining the messages of the political parties, right? What she wants is for the political parties themselves to be shaping the debate, right? She doesn't want people, ordinary people, talking to one another, expressing their views to one another, persuading one another, having arguments with one another, confronting one another going through the normal, again, to use that word, procedure during a general election campaign, right? So she has a very, very strange conception of what democracy means. It's almost as though what the voter should be doing is entirely individually and entirely in a kind of atomized way, simply looking at what the political parties say and then making the decision about who to vote for on that basis. That's a completely, completely two-dimensional understanding of what democracy really is, right? Because the truth of the matter is who you vote for depends very much on the opinions of the people around you, the circumstances in which you find yourself, the conversations that you have with other people. I was just chatting with a colleague just yesterday over lunch who's an absolute dyes-in-the-wool Labour supporter. And we had a very friendly but, sometimes slightly hard-edged debate about, what a Labour government is going to look like. And I like to think that, I doubt I had an influence on his decision to vote Labour, given that he's a Labour member, but I like to think that I managed to, kind of have a small amount of influence, or at least sow some seeds of doubt in his mind, and no doubt he thinks the same about me. And that's really what democracy is, right? It's a representation of the kind of the interactions between all of the different members of the population in the aggregate as they kind of discuss things with one another, as they experience the world, as they enter into a kind of a dialogue with one another. Democracy is what emerges from that. So, yeah, there's something very, very, very blinkered and very artificial, and I'll use that word two-dimensional again, about Marianna Spring's understanding of democracy, and by extension, the understanding of democracy that I think that her class, the kind of new elite class, as McGrogan calls them, really have about the world in which they live and the views that ordinary people have.
Now, perhaps in a way, this is a fairly dog bites man story, in that we know that the BBC takes quite a sort of censorious and infantilizing attitude to its viewers and has a great disdain for parties like the Reform Party. But you also identify something quite interesting in your article, which you describe as the thought process behind these kinds of initiatives and this reporting, and that's what you call the tyrannical tendency of Marianna Spring and people like her. Could you just explain that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very important that, when you use the word tyranny, people immediately think you're being hyperbolic and you're exaggerating things, because obviously Marianna Spring is not a tyrant in the classic mold in which we think of a tyrant, right? She's not Stalin, she's not Pol Pot. I'm not putting her in that category. So we have to take a step back and examine what the word tyranny meant to the people who came up with the word, the ancient Greeks, and what they understood by what tyranny was. So tyranny, as understood by Socrates, was rule that was not constitutionally legitimate, right? And which was therefore based purely on the self-interest of the ruler, right? That's what tyranny really means. Rule kind of at the whim of the ruler, who doesn't have a constitutional basis for ruling, right? They've either usurped power or they have somehow insinuated themselves into a position of power through a kind of extra constitutional process, right? Now, the Greeks were very interested in tyranny. They hated tyranny, right? Whenever you look at Greek, political philosophical writing, it's always about, well, it's not always about, but it's very often about the evils of tyranny and why tyranny should be avoided. So they were very interested in the consequences of tyranny as they understood it. So in Aristotle and in Xenophon, you find this idea explored. What does tyranny actually look like? And how is it constituted? How does tyranny work in practice? And their idea was, well, the tyrant wants more than anything else to stay in power, right? What is tyranny really all about? Well, it's about a ruler who has usurped power. It doesn't have constitutional legitimacy. In other words, doesn't have a kind of legal basis for their rule, right? Isn't representative, hasn't been elected or, inherited power kind of through a legitimate process, like a monarchical process. So all they want is to retain power, right? That is the primary goal of the tyrant. So tyranny is the form of government that wants to remain in power for its own sake, right? It just wants to keep power. That's what tyranny is really about. So how do you achieve that? Well, what you do, and this is clear in both Aristotle and in Xenophon, is you need to make the population reliant on the tyrant's existence, right? So tyranny is about making it impossible to actually remove the tyrant. by making him or his government necessary to the population, right? You make your own government necessary to the population, so they won't dare to remove you, right? They'll think you to be too important or too necessary to remove. And the way you achieve that is by making the population vulnerable and passive, to resemble, as Aristotle would have described it, slaves, right? You do everything in your power to weaken the population so that they are scared to remove you as the ruler, right? They think that you are important and necessary. So you make the population as passive and as pliant and as needy as you can. And that means three things. So you have to deny the population property rights, right? So you have to deny them the opportunity to gain a kind of autonomous, prosperous existence of their own, right? So you deny them property rights. You deny them the right to have a private life, okay? So you force everything that they do out into the open, partly so that you can spy on them, but partly also so that they're scared to express their own opinions, right? They don't have a mechanism by which to express their own opinions, because everything is public, right? Everything is known, everything's out in the open. And you also, by extension, the third element is that you deny them private opinions of their own as such, right? You tell them what their opinions ought to be, and you deny them the capacity to form their own opinions, so that they're kind of reliant on you almost for you know, the gospel or the moral framework by which to live, right? So it would be too strong to say that Marianna Spring is herself, you know, a tyrant. You know, she obviously doesn't think of herself in that way. But you can see the kind of, in the way that she understands democracy, or the way that she understands the kind of disinformation, misinformation problem, gives us a kind of a glimmer of what tyranny is really all about, or a kind of a lens onto which we can look on the essence of tyranny, as it were, right? This is somebody who has no legitimacy in her own right, to tell anybody what to do, and representing an elite class which also has no real legitimacy, right? This, what Matt Goodwin calls the new elite, this kind of top, you know, kind of 15 or 20% of the population who increasingly think of themselves as being the kind of deserving rulers or governors of society, doesn't really have any kind of constitutional legitimacy or any kind of grounds for telling the rest of society what to do, but it wants to do that anyway, right? So in the sense that she kind of represents the emergence of this new elite that's very keen on bossing the rest of us around and telling us what to do, she kind of is a kind of avatar for that lack of constitutional legitimacy, as I've described it. And in order for that regime, that class that she represents, to kind of justify its own existence and to keep itself in power, it needs to portray to the population this idea that you don't really know what you're talking about, you're not very intelligent, you're not very well educated, you're needy, you're vulnerable, you're weak, you're corrupt, and therefore you should just kind of passively imbibe the opinions and the information that we give to you, right? You shouldn't be forming opinions of your own. You certainly shouldn't be kind of interacting with one another and kind of, you know, forming opinions that way. There is something deeply illegitimate about that, because you are fundamentally foolish and, you know, uneducated and corrupt, right? So that's the kind of tyrannical discourse as somebody like Aristotle would have understood it. You're denying the population to form their own opinions, right? And the reason why you're doing that is because it's so important for you to portray yourself as being necessary, to present yourself as being the source of truth, right? Because you, as the tyrant, want to maintain your position of power, right? You want to maintain your position of government. Because you're fundamentally insecure, right? You don't have that constitutional legitimacy that would secure your rule through another means. You might remember Jacinda Ardern during the height of the pandemic made this comment in a speech that she gave in New Zealand, where she described her government as being the sole source of truth. I think it was that she said, And you can see there that mentality is much more explicit, right? That kind of Marianna Spring, theory, if I can put it that way, of information, right? Where you as the individual voter, the individual citizen, are supposed to just kind of take the truth from above. It's just handed down to you. You don't have a private opinion of your own, right? And you're not supposed to you're not supposed to express any private opinion of your own. You are instead supposed to simply kind of imbibe and parrot the quote unquote information that's given to you by the people who really know best. So that is a tyrannical impulse. I think it's legitimate to call that a tyrannical impulse, even though we can accept that, we're not about to, we're not seeing emerging, I don't think, at least I certainly hope not, the emergence of a kind of, Stalinist understanding of the relationship between governor and governed. You can still see the kind of the roots of that sort of a thought process in the approach that people like Marianna Spring take to the subject matter of information. This censorship industrial complex that has emerged. So that's why I think thinking of it in the terms of tyranny is quite useful, actually, and quite important. It hits on something important.
David McGrogan, thanks very much for coming on. Now, the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns were some of the most consequential political events in recent years. And the general election campaign we're going through at the moment is the first post-COVID election. So why is no one talking about it? Well, I'm pleased to be joined now by Alex Kriel, a writer and contributor to the Daily Sceptic and the founder of thinkingcoalition.org, who's been analysing a lot of the post-COVID response. Good to have you here, Alex.
Thank you.
Now, one of the big themes of the general election campaign at the moment, as it is in any campaign, has been the NHS. The Tories have been getting it in the neck over the waiting lists, and all the parties are making major promises to find a way to reduce them. But of course, there's a great big elephant in the room here, because one of the big reasons that NHS waiting times have gone up so much was lockdown. And yet it seems that practically no politician is willing to talk about this from any of the parties. So Alex, you've written about this week for the Daily Sceptic. What's going on here? Why does no one want to talk about lockdown?
Well, I think really what's going on is they're in a way all complicit in that. And you're right. If you look at a chart, any sensible chart, you can see the explosion in waiting lists started really in March 2020 when they introduced the lockdowns. It's a sort of one-to-one correspondence. So as you said, it's the elephant in the room. It's unbelievable for me that you can look at a chart and discuss anything other than lockdowns. So talking about party politics is irrelevant within the scale of what's happened. And I think the real issue is that all the parties, well, at least who voted on lockdowns, are complicit, and the media are also complicit. And, we can get to at the end. I think there's also a bigger agenda that they don't want to take lockdowns off the table for the future. So they're kind of leaving it in the back pocket. And that means ignoring the tremendous damage caused by lockdown, including on the NHS waiting list.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point, obviously many people will have a sense that the NHS has been damaged by lockdown and by the encouragement to stay at home and protect the NHS. But could you just give us a sense of how big of a scale of the impact that has had?
The overall list has gone up. I'm using rough numbers now, from about 4 million to 7.5 million. So you've added 3.5 million people. It's a huge, it's a mind-boggling number, more or less, since lockdown. And the really bad category is obviously the category who are waiting longest. That's over 52 weeks to be seen. And that's gone essentially from, it was 1,600 before lockdown, but you could say it's roughly zero. That's gone up to 300 odd thousand. So you've created 300,000 people now who waited more than a year for their treatment. And that number had been stable around that kind of 1,600 level for, more or less a decade. There was really no waiting list in that more than 52-week category until lockdown started, and then it just exploded up to about 300,000. And very little sign of that going down. It's sort of stable, but not going down. So, and then of course you can work out an average waiting time. And the average waiting time now, you've got that small group and a very long waiting time, but I think the average is now about 14 weeks, which again is more or less, it's not quite double, but it's almost double where it used to be. So it's an enormous breathtaking impact. Millions of people added onto the list, and then again that 300 odd thousand in that very important group, which is waiting more than a year for surgery.
I mean, it's an enormous number. And I mean, in another time, obviously, an opposition party would be trying to make hay out of this. They'd be saying, hey, look at all this damage this has caused. Look at the lockdown that you brought in. And we said not to do this at the time, and you brought it in, and look what's happened. But of course, the Labour Party certainly can't say this, because in many cases, not only did they not oppose the government's lockdown policies, they cheered it on and said it should be more severe, more harsh. So is that partly why there's so little discussion of lockdown in this campaign?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wrote the article is that crazy chart that you saw from the FT journalist. The continuous data only exists from 2007, so I have no idea how he stitched together historic figures, because there were different data sets measured and prepared in a completely different way. But the key issue is he's again trying to make a political point out of this, but then that all falls apart if you look at what happened in Labour Wales, because the situation there is even worse than England. So there's no political issue here. This is a lockdown issue, and the Labour guys in Wales handled it even more badly than England. So the whole premise of that article was kind of was ridiculous, and they should have just focused on the reality of the lockdown impact. And they've tried to sort of force in this political narrative that just doesn't fit. Firstly, by really, as far as I can work out, essentially inventing numbers pre 2007. And then coming up with this narrative that, again, completely doesn't fit with the reality of what's happening in Wales. This is not a political football.
So I suppose what some people might say is, yes, we had a lockdown. Yes, it was terrible. Yes, it had terrible effects. But, that's all in the past now. There's not currently a pandemic on. Can't we just sort of forget about that and talk about the future? Can't we just let bygones be bygones, really? What do you say to that argument?
I would say definitely not, because as I kind of hinted at the beginning, I think they want to leave these lockdowns as a tool to use again in the future. And it's not only in this general election campaign, nobody's really talking seriously about lockdown, but also in the COVID inquiry, kind of famously or infamously, has not really addressed that issue either. So we've got a disastrous policy that's out there that nobody's discussing, and we're not making any conclusions from it. If you're not making conclusions from it, then there's every chance you're going to do it again. So, that there should have been a proper acknowledgement of the tremendous harms. This is just one area, of course, NHS waiting list. Adding millions of people onto the waiting list is just one element. And we should acknowledge, okay, this happened, it was due to this, and we don't want to do that again. I think that's why it's important to, discuss this issue. And also another thing I've been looking at is, of course, there were enormous winners from lockdown. None of us, none of the general public will be winners, but the certain selected financial interests made. I mean, in the US, the number is $6.4 trillion is how much they increased their net worth over the lockdown period. Because you basically shut down a lot of small businesses and you printed a lot of money, which for those asset owners was, a double godsend. So again, we need to be, and I don't want to forget all about it, because if you've got people in the background who benefited enormously, there's every chance they're going to want to do this again. So I think we have to acknowledge the tremendous harms. Of course, it's easier for everyone to forget. And that's what's happening. We're just pretending it never happened. But that's a dangerous situation to be in for repeating this going forward.
And so obviously there's an official COVID inquiry going on at the moment, but it sounds like you're not a big fan of it. What's going wrong with the COVID inquiry? And why do you think we're not learning the right lessons from it, in your view?
The real issue is they want to retain this as a policy, as a measure going forward. So I don't think they want it criticised. I think that, to me, is what this is, because we have crystal clear evidence from Ioannidis, the famous Stanford biostatistician, that this doesn't work. I mean, it's pretty definitive. And none of that is getting into the inquiry. You've seen quite an angry response from the QC or KC when the issue's raised. It's like, we're not here to discuss the merits of it. We're just here to sort of play around the edges. And I think my feeling is what's driving that is because they probably intend to at least retain the option of doing this again. And that's why they don't want to really pick apart the numbers. And as I said, the numbers are not that difficult to pick apart because we've already got these studies, so we know it doesn't work. But they just don't want to go there.
Okay, so we like to be positive here on The Sceptic. So what should a proper COVID inquiry look like in your view? How could it improve?
Well, I mean, we should hear from proper scientists who have done the research. I mean, and these guys are world class. I mean, Ian Eades is a world class biostatistician. Why isn't he in there? We saw the bad way they handled Carl Hennigan. He was sort of handled very badly. He wasn't allowed to say his piece. So I think we should get real people who have done real analysis in and hear from them. This has to make sense, and right now it doesn't make sense. I think they want to keep lockdowns, and they therefore don't expose the tremendous damages caused and the lack of effectiveness. I mean, that's the other issue. If Ian Eades had come back and said, look at these results, comparing countries with and without lockdown, there's just no benefit.
Okay, so we've spoken about this almost uniparty between the Tories and Labour, where they're essentially in agreement over not wanting to talk about lockdown and what their potential pandemic policy might be in the future. Now, obviously, one of the parties that is upending the two-party system a little bit at the moment is the Reform Party. And one of their more interesting proposals with regards to this is their proposal to reject the World Health Organization pandemic treaty and to cancel Britain's membership of the WHO unless there's fundamental reform to the structure and funding that we're giving them. So what do you make of that, Alex? Is that the way to go?
I think basically, yes, the way that WHO is going. I mean, the WHO always had a useful role to play in monitoring pandemic outbreaks and sort of centralizing data. That made a lot of sense, but they have themselves tried to move to a sort of one-size-fits-all policy dictation from Switzerland, and that doesn't make sense, and that we should reject. So I'm all for that, but I'm also, cognizant of the fact that a lot of the policies they announce, like a lot of politicians always announce great policies, but I also look back and see what people did at the time, and I'm definitely not impressed with what they actually did in 2020 to 2023. That was the time to fight this, really. Okay, we should stop it happening again in the future, but they were not manning the barricades back in the day. I mean, as you know, your whole operation essentially was set up because there was nobody manning the barricade to oppose this stuff. So Toby Young and you guys set all of this up, which I think is brilliant. But very much on our own. There was more or less nothing available from anyone. So I always have that in the back of my mind when people announce how these great policies they're going to fix whatever. Where were you? Where were you for those years?
Okay, well, strong stuff there from Alex Kriel. Thanks very much for coming on. That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.